means of production commonly, communally owned. Right? How do we return the product of labor to the laborer? By having the factory be owned communally by the workers. Right? So instead of, at the end of the day, me, the owner of the factory, paying all of my workers a wage, and then taking all of the products of their labor and selling it for a profit that is privately owned by me, the owner, Marx thinks what should happen is that the products of the factory as a whole should be owned communally by all the workers, and the profits from the sale of the products of that labor should be shared communally by all the workers, meaning that every worker would see and have ownership over the product of their labor. They wouldn't, in return for their labor, get a wage. They would retain ownership of the product of their labor and benefit from the product of that labor through their communal share in the profit of the factory as a whole. So that is, in essence, the idea of communism and of the communist idea of, or critique of, private property, which we'll talk about in just a second. So the important thing to see here is that for Marx, wage labor in itself, which is a mainstay of capitalism, especially early on, commodifies workers, putting a price on their labor and thus on their very humanity. Right? It turns them into objects, right? As Marx puts it, articles of commerce exposed to the vicissitudes and fluctuations of the market. Right? It objectifies them and dehumanizes them. So this obviously feeds the distaste and resentment of the working classes, as well as the haughtiness of the rich. Right? Right? Why is there this sort of accepted social scorn for the working class? Right? That they are unable to pull themselves up by the bootstraps. If they only saved their pennies, they'd be able to make it. They must be lazy, right? They're everything that is lower class is bad, is worse than what is middle or upper class, right? The values of the working class are poor values, bad values, right? And we can walk by, people suffering on the street, people without homes. We can ignore the poor and the plight of the poor, in part because the capitalist system allows for this dehumanizing of the laborer, of the worker. Right? And this also feeds into why we valorize the wealthy and the rich. Right? What does it mean to be human? It means to, to produce things, according to Marx, and to benefit from those products. And who do we see as the producers in a capitalist economy? Not the workers that actually create things, actually build and produce things, but instead the capitalists who bring those things to market and produce not commodities but profits. Right? So your wealth becomes a marker of your productivity, right, as a capitalist, and therefore you are more valuable the richer you are, right? So Marx's theory, essentially, that we attach, uh, the value of humanity to the value of one's products in some way is borne out by this. Except that we believe that the true producers, or we are sort of conditioned under capitalism to think of the real producers as being the owners of the factories rather than the people who work in the factories. Now, there's one other thing that I want to right, so I'll just read this from my notes, right? And this is why we understand, or why we tend to think of that rich people are more like people than poor people, who are more like objects, who are in any event less valuable than rich people based on the price per hour of their labor or their overall economic value, right? So why it's easy to overlook the poor, but a rich person in trouble is more deserving of our sympathy. This is a product of capitalism. Now, I want to say one thing. Marx goes on here to then discuss cosmopolitanism, and this is an interesting discussion for Marx to enter into. We remember cosmopolitanism also as a Kantian value, right, where the kingdom of ends, the ultimate goal of Kantian morality, is to reach this cosmopolitan perspective in which we have a global society of people pursuing their own ends, following the categorical imperative, and that's going to be cosmopolitan. A city made up of everyone in the planet, right? A completely unified society. So we've discussed a little bit the effect of colonialism on capitalism, right? The fact that just as capitalism is becoming orthodoxy, colonialism is also at its peak or speeding up, ramping up, and that so much of the wealth that is being accrued by the owner class, the bourgeois class, is coming from colonial plundering. We've talked about this, but there's also this aspect of cosmopolitanism in capitalism. Capitalism promotes cosmopolitanism in a certain way, and Kant, I think, would, for the most part, believe that you could have an ethical form of capitalism that would promote cosmopolitanism in a ethically acceptable way, if we want to compare this to Kant. But capitalism promotes cosmopolitanism primarily through global trade. And global trade is immediately connected back to colonialism. Right? Colonialism is the foundation for what is now global trade. Right? It was the end of the colonial period in the 50s and early 60s, where global trade really becomes an issue, right? Where international trade is no longer just between European countries, but now we think of global trade, right? No longer are the in the 19th century we have the anti-colonial revolutions beginning in South America, and that continues through the 20th century in South America, in Asia, in India, in Africa. And as all those countries, decolonialize, the way that the colonial powers maintain economic control or economic power in those countries is through global trade. Right? So Marx's discussion of cosmopolitanism is to show the way that cosmopolitanism of a certain kind is also about maintaining a oppressor-oppressed relationship between not just bourgeois and proletariat within a nation, but also to continue the oppressor-oppressed relation between colonist and colonized under the aegis of free trade. Right? Cosmopolitanism becomes a way for capitalism to spread around the globe, and the celebration of cosmopolitanism is, in some sense, a celebration of the global hegemony of the capitalist class. So Marx, one point he wants to make is that this is bad for the survival of a nation or a people. Now, this is an interesting debate that Marx is getting into, right? We could see this as xenophobic, right? Fear of global culture or society. And we can understand it, and I think it's correct to understand it in part as Marx being concerned about the strength of a national economy. We need to take care of our workers and give our neighbors work rather than find workers and resources in other countries for cheaper prices, right? So what is global trade about? It is, in part, or begins with finding resources from non-Western countries for much cheaper prices than you could find them in, right, quote-unquote, developed countries in Europe or the United States. So there's always something exploitative about it. But this becomes much more intense and more extreme as capitalism progresses, right? Especially after the 1980s and in the 1990s, where we see massive offshoring with the creation of NAFTA and the World Bank in, I believe, 1995 and 1996, respectively. We see this massive offshoring where all manufacturing is moved, or almost all manufacturing is moved out of quote-unquote developed countries, Western countries, European countries, and the United States, and moved to quote-unquote developing countries, moved in particular to China. Right? So manufacturing jobs all leave the United States and move to China, to India, to Vietnam, to other countries that are much, much less rich. Right? Why? Because in those countries you can pay workers a fraction of the price. You don't have to follow the same labor and safety practices. There's an enormous economic incentive, right? And what Marx is pointing out is that in both of these cases, in the older version where